one of her master's students or PhD? PhD student put together involved looking at school emergency plans. They're on the table outside the door. They're really interesting in just in terms of another way of, besides the publishing the thesis and then actually publishing formal papers in the literature. It's really an interesting way to get out a message on what out to users as what they could do. I'm taking them back for a couple of students that we've got working on related issues just as a dissemination mechanism. So this afternoon we're here for the plenary to discuss the interdisciplinary breakout groups that we had this morning, and we will start, as always, with the purple group, Group A. Walker, Ann. Well, the two of you did the computer thing, so.
We don't get to look at anything here.
Yeah. Okay, the little dot here, that's your advance.
Great.
And there'll be 10. I'll give you a 2-minute sign if you're.
A little dot here or
yeah,
here?
Yeah, that's forward.
Okay, and is there a pointer? No.
Not what?
Okay.
Actually, let's see.
So we had an excellent discussion, and thanks to Walker for leading that primarily. A really good group at NSF and NOAA, well represented. So I'm going to go through 5 slides in 3 minutes, so we have time for questions. No, I'm just trying to see if you're awake. First, what we did is we went around the room. So we have a number of different points that people made that we've tried to coordinate into categories that are related. The first point that was made was to leverage partnerships to address research barriers. At this point, most of these points were made yesterday, and we talked about some different aspects of them. And the key example of this was the quality of data that are available currently is impeded by barriers between agencies and between states and agencies and between non-governmental organizations and agencies. So interagency mortality and morbidity in particularly, the data sharing issues have kept people from accessing FEMA data. CDC has data, and Red Cross has data, and the National Weather Service could use access to some of those data. So we're taking advantage of new MOUs and partnerships with the other agencies. We should be able to improve the quality of the existing data on tornado outcomes tremendously. Second, also mentioned yesterday, independent and standardized rapid post-event assessment. We need assessments when things go well as when they go poorly. We also need to think about what sampling strategies, not just for post-event assessment, but in general for studying both characteristics of human behavior and storm behavior that will work for both physical and social sciences. But in post-event assessment, sampling strategies are critical. And there are examples not only between FAA and the NTSB in the case of airplane crashes, but also there are seismic teams that go out after earthquakes, and we could use them as another example of the way in which these kinds of post-event assessments could be designed. So there are some analogs to use as design guidance. Studying human behavior and what motivates people during events. We need to think not just about the big disasters, but as we mentioned earlier, think about both what goes well and what people do already, not just when they're dying. So that's Eve's point, and she makes it well. There are a whole series of issues that are related to communication and public perception that came up from participants across the spectrum. Has the public calibrated their response to the quality of the current warning, constancy of lead time over the years, for example? So what do we know about people's perceptions and the understandings that they have of current systems and current warning processes and how those are going to affect changes? How does lead time affect different groups? How does lead time affect the disabled? How does lead time affect administrators and their planning horizons? We need to understand the different perspective issues. In particular, this had to do with the perspective of a forecaster who has a God's eye view of the weather system and sees has an atmospheric view, so to speak. Whereas the person on the ground is sort of a sitting duck and has a I'm in the middle of it perspective and doesn't see things the same way at all. So we can use new technologies to blend these perspectives, but they have different implications depending on where people are sitting and which perspectives they're using. So communications confusion. There was some concern about the fact that we have different systems of communications that people are using. We have weather radio, sirens, apps and media, and they may be giving consistent or inconsistent information. The landscape of communication, media and modes is changing rapidly, and how those interact is also changing, so we need to take that into account and study what the net effects of that, what the net effects of that is. Social media and warning dissemination, verification, credibility, consistency. How do people use this information to make an informed decision? Warren has a wonderful anecdote about this. And once again, the social media landscape is transforming rapidly. And related to communication and perception research, NOAA already does have some education and outreach, some of which is highly valued, but we're not sure how evaluated it is. And that should be assessed and renewed and integrated into the rest of the communications research that NOAA should be doing. There was a pretty long discussion of forecasters as parts of teams, and there's, as this I believe was Robert's point, came up yesterday, that there's a lot of research on team expertise and how what makes teams work well and what makes teams work poorly, and it doesn't appear that much of that research has been applied to forecasting offices. So there's a big potential to improve the functioning of forecast offices in that regard. Forecasters are also the first consumers. How do we train forecasters? How do we integrate them into research? How do we take into account their cognitive load issues and what's happening with the changes in their responsibilities over time? How do forecasters make specific decisions, for example, how far out to extend warnings? We need to look not only at the gestation of the storm, but also the cessation of the storm. What's the optimal update frequency? How can we coordinate or standardize different policies across offices, and to what extent should they be coordinated or standardized? And how often should we provide information? This is the update frequency again. We need to also think about how new forecasting skills, such as forecast intensity, are being used, whether they're appropriate, and when they're being launched, is that being evaluated, and is the information from that launch being incorporated into future activities? There's a whole set of research projects around developing new forecasting devices and observational technologies. For example, ultrasound, next-generation storm-penetrating aircraft that are being developed with NSF funding now, deployable networks of sensors. There was some discussion of leveraging ubiquitous technologies. There's already a project at UCAR now on looking at instrumenting cars to be able to even windshield wipers to collect data on precip. So a lot of interesting ideas out there. There might be room for a new program on this that would coordinate investments and partnerships in new technologies. And we need quantitative assessment, of course, of any systems. And I can get this thing. And then finally, there were a whole series of things that we thought should go under urgent needs previously mentioned that this group strongly supported and wanted to see followed through on. False alarms in particular, a lot of discussion about definition and perception issues that we need to think about broadening both the continuum of time. As Eve pointed out, people make decisions the whole week prior to or during storm seasons as not just the 15 minutes prior to the potential tornado. And there's also a continuum of ways of thinking about forecasts. They could be near misses or neighboring events, not just false alarms. And Eve, I hope you'll correct me if I've gotten anything wrong here. But she has her student by Lindsay Barnes has a paper in Weather and Forecasting that it touches on these topics. So clearly a lot of room for more research on false alarms and related topics. Probabilistic and forecast uncertainty. This crosses almost all themes, and there are issues with both how you communicate uncertainty. This goes across all low probability, high consequence events, so it's not unique to tornadoes. But there are also issues with the best ways of developing this kind of system and how it gets used in different decision-making contexts. Lead time, that's been discussed a lot. Issues of the disabled, those who are living alone, and susceptible populations. And the point that we need an integrated tornado risk analysis, both as a basis for prioritizing research as well as a basis for looking at how to develop performance metrics for specific research systems, so that we know what the potential is for preparedness, for example, to decrease risk from tornadoes. And finally, the point about an Office of Human Dimensions of Weather. Some of the people in the room wanted to say weather and climate, and there were a few voices in the room for putting this outside of NOAA, so there was a full range of opinions about this, though a lot of support for increased social science research on weather integrated with physical and engineering sciences, for example. And finally, Harold says we need something tangible and focused from this workshop. Thank you.
Anybody from the group want to say that she messed up? Didn't think so. Okay. Next group is the blue group. Okay. Right dot is your advance, and the mini-Mac is right there on the table. Yep. And that's your target. Okay.
Well, we had a lot of fun. Had a lot of interesting things to talk about. I don't know how well we accomplished our mission. You can judge that as you go through these slides. I'm probably going to misrepresent various things that are said, so I hope group members will feel free to correct me. I have the feeling some of them will. Okay. We started talking about unidentified research needs, things that had not yet been mentioned or not mentioned in a certain way. One of the things that we talked about was essentially a project to do research into what would be needed to do research. And if we wanted to extend forecasts of tornadoes that were usefully accurate to 24 to 48 hours in advance. And parenthetically, I would include forecasts of tornado intensity with that as well. There was some discussion of what's called formative evaluation of potential changes to forecast and warning technology and the impacts on behavior and or economic value. Formative evaluation, as I understand it, is essentially we need to study these things in the process of developing technological changes to the warning system. We need to start thinking about these issues well in advance of the time that we are reaching the stage where new ideas are about to be implemented. The idea is to start investigating these issues early and continue them, and that clearly includes a large human dimension. How effective might these products be? What's the cost benefit, and so on. A whole range of topics came up during those discussions. Someone mentioned the fact that our decision makers have to make decisions all the time. That's presumably what they get paid the big bucks to do. And we don't even know necessarily how to provide our input to them so that it would be of maximum value to those decision makers. And I think that's an issue that confronts us directly right here. The notion of risk and risk perception was considered to be a useful framework for merging a lot of the disparate elements that are contained within what we've been talking about. And frankly, I was having some difficulty following all that line of reasoning, but I think I basically like the idea of having such a framework to tie all the pieces together, and this was at least a candidate that should be considered, the notion of risk and risk perceptions. Implementing changes to the warning infrastructure, how do we go about doing that? And if we're going to implement changes to the warning structure, are we sure that that we're not going to mess up the system in the process of trying to fix it? We all agreed that there needs to be a change in NOAA's decision-making culture. They tend to make decisions in a certain way with respect to the social sciences in particular, but even broader than that. And I believe it was mentioned that there have been recommendations from other meetings to the effect that NOAA needs to reconsider how they make decisions. So we're simply reinforcing a message that they've already gotten. So we wanted to make sure to reinforce that message. I think we need to do some work about not only what are the possible changes we might make in the future, but we need to get a better handle on where we are now. How effective and useful are the products we are now using? We cannot possibly move forward until we have a better idea of where we are standing at the moment. I think there was some considerable consensus on that. It's an interesting thought that deserves some additional research is the fact that many people struggle with identifying actually where they are. If a warning message is couched in terms of certain geographical features, how effective is that at communicating that information, that risk information to the recipients? Some people are very adept at saying, all right, well, if the tornado is going to be at 12th and Lindsay, I know where that is. Other people say, I haven't got a clue where that is. It should be, you should tell me in terms of, well, it's right beside the Walmart or whatever. So there's quite a bit of variation in the population about how they perceive risk and its relationship to them. And that is tied to our geographical descriptions. There is a broad spectrum of users of weather information, and I think we need to consider that whole spectrum to the maximum extent possible. The public is not a monolithic block. It's made up of a very diverse set of individuals who have different perceptions, and I think ultimately we need to be sure we've sampled as much of that as we can as we try to move forward. It was made clear that NOAA needs to, if not support it financially, they need to endorse NSF support of this multidisciplinary work. It'd be nice if they supported it as well, but failing that, they should definitely send the message to NSF in unambiguous language that this is something that they want, they need, and they definitely endorse. A topic came up that was kind of interesting that I've heard about before, this disconnect between what people say they need and what they actually need and what they actually use. And obviously this in the social sciences is a relatively well-recognized phenomenon. We need to take advantage of what the social sciences know about that so that we don't confuse ourselves with surveys that actually describe what people say they need but don't actually reflect what they use. It was mentioned that in addition to post-event surveys, there were some interest in seeing pre-event surveys, teams going out in advance of severe weather to conduct surveys and find out how people are reacting to the advanced information, in addition to the follow-up after the event occurs. We had this wonderful matrix, which we probably were more confused by than anything else. We struggled, but I think we managed to come up with a couple of elements regarding this. There was considerable interest in the relationship between the forecast warning process and the communication of that weather information to a wide variety of users who are either not English speakers or have some sort of communication disorder, perhaps deaf or autistic or whatever, and that needs to be investigated further. The subject of insurance and how that interacts with economics and so on was something that was not mentioned yesterday, and it was felt that this was something we needed to pursue. And there was some lively discussion about community sheltering options. How do communities make decisions about what they're going to do with regard to shelters? And so that was a final topic. We had a lot of fun with this, but we never managed to come up with anything to add to the existing evaluation criteria. So we are mute, except that we endorse the criteria that were listed in our instructions page. So with that, I think I'm done and ready for whatever questions you might have.
Anyone want to complain about how you misrepresented them?
I'm shocked.
Questions, comments? We're a very quiet, compliant group today.
We're exhausted. All right.
Mike and I will admit that perhaps the matrix was not fully explained. But that's in keeping with the movie series, so yeah, and in fact, if somebody figured out the matrix, we have a job for you at the end of the meeting. So, okay. I'm just an observer. Okay. Green. Is that you, Kevin? Okay. But you look, you've walked to the front before he did. Okay. There's your advances.
He's going to come up.
Oh, yes. And then there's your little computer to aim it.
Okay. He's going to come up and explain something more complicated than I can explain later on. But you'll see some consensus here on what we talked about with previous groups, but we spent more time talking about the false alarm issue that we'll get into here in a moment. So we discussed multiple methods from a variety of disciplines, or the need for multiple disciplines from a variety of disciplines to assess the warning process at all levels of stakeholder involvement. Second bullet there, how do forecasters conceptualize false alarms? So there's the false alarm issue. We need to get consumers involved before and after an event to assess comprehension and compliance of the warnings. Are the warnings considered to be point predictions or area predictions or whatever? Empirically explore impact of habituation on compliance. How does the attitudinal basis influence compliance? So this is the continued false alarm, persistent, repeated false alarm kind of thing. The need to establish collaborations to evaluate the language of warnings. And we talked about this dire warning that the Wichita office issued on a strong tornado or a devastating tornado recently. Determine what science outcomes and potential applications are worth investment of research dollars. So we talked about this false alarm, and here's the false alarm 101 definition of what a false alarm is, where you have reports present, reports absent in the left-hand column, and then a hit if you have a report present with the actual phenomenon occurring. False alarm is when that event doesn't occur, but it is forecast. And then a miss when that report is absent, but the event happens. And then a correct rejection when there is no report, there is no forecast, and no result, no event. Now this is where Robert comes in, because he put together this more complicated diagram that he's going to explain to you.
This is, I guess, a matrix that could strangle a motion picture producer. The feeling I got yesterday was that people were talking a lot about how do we define a false alarm. I think that's a red herring, because what we're dealing with is multiple concepts, each of which will require a definition. So we pull this apart. A lot of this is measurement theory 101. So on the right in that green box, I thought about trying to smash into a forecast everything that I possibly could. Hail or something between small hail and lots of rain may or may not happen 0.6 in our county sometime this afternoon or whatever. All the different kinds of things that you could jam into a forecast. Well, what if we unpack those? So you could have a point prediction. X will happen at point Y at time Z. That's the signal detection theory notion. And at that level, you can have a little 2x2. But once you go beyond a point forecast, the 2x2 doesn't work anymore. Okay? You can have an areal prediction, a temporal prediction, a range prediction, a prediction involving uncertainty, a category prediction, also a magnitude, which we didn't have here. We had it on a subsequent iteration. So you just take that breakout and make your matrix. So your diagonal is going to be your hits. Now, every cell over here is a different kind of false alarm. Response number one, oh, gee, that's complicated. My answer says the weather. And if we're bringing social science into this, we got to suck it up and deal with the complexity. Now, where you are in this matrix is going to be a function of the nature of your forecast. If your forecast involves an aerial prediction over some range with some degree of uncertainty, then you're going to be in a certain combinatoric here. So to the forecaster, how it turns out in hindsight, okay, and this is all hindsight analysis, how it turns out in hindsight is going to tell you where you are in that matrix. What's the value added? Specific guidance as to how you might want to rethink your forecasting strategy. It's a tool that the forecaster could use, okay? If we come up with meaningful labels for these different kinds of false alarms, we might expect to find clusters. And this cluster would be bad false alarms. This cluster might be, well, okay, false alarms. There might be clusters from the standpoint of the emergency manager or the customer. This cluster is kinds of false alarms that might really detract from how much the consumer believes in the forecast, or how much trust they're going to put in the forecast, and therefore what kind of action they may or may not take. Some other cluster might be false alarms that won't influence the public very much. So this could be a tool for forecasters. It could be a tool for meteorologists to come up with different kinds of more analytic skill scores. And it could also potentially be a tool to use in warning forecasts and evaluating public response. This is just a bowl of spaghetti thrown at the wall. I don't think that any of this is final or cast in stone, but I think it does fall out from basic philosophy of science of measurement theory, psychophysics 101, and that's why it came to me so easily once I realized that we needed to talk about different kinds of false alarms and get away from that simple 2x2.
Okay. We were confused by this matrix too. For what it's worth, 1, 2, 3, false alarms, warnings, and behavioral response for all stakeholders. Project evaluation criteria. Resources are required, of course, funds, cross-disciplinary personnel, good data, and time. Time to completion is, we consider that to be open-ended. Time to implementation as soon as possible. Barriers to implementation would be pre-existing conceptualizations, budget constraints, duplications of efforts or lack of knowledge sharing. Other considerations include formation of cross-disciplinary consortium activities to address specific changes. I think we also put in this file, for the record, a list of social science disciplines, just to have that in the materials for the record.
David?
One impediment to research is,
For the record.
One impediment to the research seems to be different missions on the NOAA side and the NSF side. One is very much practically focused, and the other one is groundbreaking, game-changing things. And I think that that is something that one has to decide that, you know, if the research is simply about improving the forecast or prediction for tomorrow, that's one thing. But I don't think that is the overall goal of the NSF mission, which is, you know, a much larger program than that.
I want to ask a question to the social scientist just to make sure I know that one of the things I know is that we frequently have words that are used that have very technical meanings, but that also have general meanings in the dictionary. I want to make sure I'm interpreting a word correctly. When you use the word compliance, what do you mean? Someone? Yes.
Well, in the medical community and public health, we talk about, in the medical community and public health, compliance refers to if I have, I'm diagnosed with some kind of condition or disease and I'm given medication or things I'm supposed to do about it, the question is, do I comply with those? So, and there's quite a bit of research in the medical community going back lots of years that there's a lot of non-compliance with the protocols that are put out, whether they're by MDs or nurses or God knows who.
Yeah. So that in this context, we'd probably be looking at something that says that a tornado warning goes out and people take appropriate action.
Yeah, I mean, do they comply with whatever is suggested as being something that would be protective for them or whatever?
In addition, with the hurricane evacuation research, we're not only interested in whether people who are told to evacuate do evacuate, but whether people who are told they don't need to evacuate do not evacuate. So there are errors both ways. It's in tornadoes, if you tell people to shelter and they comply, clearly that's what you're interested in. If you tell them they don't need to shelter, but they do anyway, that doesn't appear to be as big of a problem because people who unnecessarily take protective action are not impeding people who need to take protective action in tornadoes. In hurricanes, you have people on the highways that don't need to be there. Those are the people that are farther inland, and they were already safe, and they're impeding the evacuation of the people who are at greatest risk.
Okay. Okay. But we also could have the lost opportunities of the fact that you canceled activities or something when you didn't need to. So
Sure.
that would be okay. I just wanted. That's what I thought it was. I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't some technical meaning to that phrase that I was missing. Any other comments or questions? I'm happy to see that we got a group to make another matrix. That's a matrix multiplication is good isn't the right word, but it's something. Yellow.
Well, as all the other groups have said, we had a very stimulating discussion, and we kind of started it out maybe for lack of anything else to talk about, which of course we all had plenty of things, but I just gave the notion based on what we talked about yesterday. If we could redesign the warning system from scratch, what would we do, knowing what we know now? So that was kind of the basis from where we got started. So we came up with about 8 different themes or projects. First one was identifying and understanding user groups. And that would require an integrated and social research, integrated social and physical research with lots of different kinds of methods, including the public, practitioners, and including weather service forecasters and private sector meteorologists and EMs, and this also includes getting into the head of the forecasters of how they create warnings and forecasts. This also includes underserved populations, how various groups have training for what they have, and this also includes uncertainty information. We sort of approach this by the fact that some groups definitely can use uncertainty information depending on how it's packaged. So we said, but we certainly need to know about that and what thresholds are appropriate for what situations for various groups or individuals. So that was the first one. The second one was, if you know that, then what kind of protective actions can people take, which is also situationally dependent, depending of where the user is, whether they're in a building or vehicle or they're outdoors or whatnot. And then based on those two things, what would be the optimal way of disseminating information, including calls to action, which I think is one of the things the previous group had sort of brought up. And of course, this is, and one way to couch the calls to action would be specifying various representative situations. You can't catch everything, but maybe a lot of various situations could be sort of pre-diagnosed and then give advice to those kind of things, including various kinds of scenarios, how you might shelter or whatever, and including identifying places in buildings that might not be adequate to certain sheltering specifications, but at least they're safer compared to others. In other words, there's probably a continuum of safety, and maybe identifying that might be of some help. The fourth thing was experimental and lab research, lab and field research on how to express uncertainty across various populations and locales, and that might include things like odds ratios and other kinds of expressions. Then we talked about mediated versus unmediated messages. In other words, the unmediated message is the one that goes directly from the Weather Service or NOAA to a consumer, and the mediated message passes through somebody else, media, emergency managers, whatever that might be. And there's an economic component to that. What's the value of those various messages? And so to do some of that, we would have to understand patterns of how these various messages are created and disseminated through the weather enterprise, integrated warning team, and so on and so forth. We also talked a little bit about what does the role of automation play with that, knowing that so many of the messaging systems are automated, and what role does that play. We also talked about having some kind of integrated approach of testing these various kinds of messages, including the appropriateness of certain kinds of graphics or visualization of messages, the best types of cartography and map presentations and things like that. Seventh one was the identification of criteria that forecasters use to create warnings and forecasts, and then also what they're evaluated against. So this would be our foray into the lead time false alarm ratio conundrum that we've been talking about. And understanding that these metrics also have to be population-based for whoever gets the message. And knowing that different populations and different situations have different acceptable ranges of what kind of uncertainty that they can handle at that time. And then the last thing we talked about was understanding what kind of process it's going to take to implement everything from research into operations, knowing that's not necessarily an obvious thing, and there's a lot of struggles in that area. So after we spent a lot of time wrangling around these 8 themes, then we basically skipped the matrix, and we just decided to try to give the evaluation criteria to all of the different 8 things. And I don't know that it's necessarily worth your time to read read through all of our rankings, except maybe some of the comments, like this particular one we thought was a high priority and probably needs to be done before any of the others in our list. Some of them might have implementation barriers because there are other stakeholders that have to be involved, FEMA emergency managers and such in the protective actions one. There's private and public roles. And one of them we talked about the need of IRB and those and other types of human factors and human subjects research coordination and things like that might have to be done. That's that particular one. And the barriers to some of these things might be the development of technology and dissemination systems to match. So with that, I'll just see if there's anybody in my group, if there's anything that I missed or if I've covered it all correctly. If not, then we'll go for questions.
So laudable to skip the matrix. No, so it's impressive that you guys got to project evaluation criteria so specifically, and given that hardly anybody else has said very much about it, this may have undue influence, or due influence. And most of what you've listed here are output criteria rather than sort of outcomes, and so it would be important to balance these with maybe an explicit expansion of A or sort of potential for these kinds of research projects to have impacts. And so,
yeah, the one thing I must say, we did the last part of it in about the last 35 minutes. So there wasn't so we went through it quickly to come up with something. There obviously needs to be more thought and a little bit more background to them, but it's at least something to start from. So,
thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thanks.
Orange.
All right, well, we had a very interesting discussion. I think we all learned a lot in our discussion this morning. What we decided to do was we came up with 4 projects or areas for research, relatively narrowly defined. So the first one would be to investigate what are the potential and actual current uses of whether convective outlooks or tornado watches or what we ended up calling severe weather outlooks, things that would be issued before storms form and before we talk about the actual warning process. We know there's a lot of interest amongst emergency managers in using these. They seem to be being used. What are they being used for? Can we document any tangible impacts of them in eventually reducing tornado impacts? Second, and this is, I think, a theme that's come up with several different discussions here, is can we predict or identify prior to impact the strength of tornadoes? Because most of the societal impacts, whether you're talking about property damage or casualties, are caused by severe and particularly violent tornadoes. And so therefore there might be some ways we can actually end up reducing impacts if we know in real time, if we know before impact exactly how strong a tornado is going to be. The third point, and this gets into the false alarm issue that's been raised by other groups as well, but we thought to examine the verification process and to ensure that the metrics that we're using actually correlate with the public's needs and our needs and expectations. And then finally, we thought another line of research would be to investigate the lead time that might be desired or needed by different specialized groups or different groups of users. whether it be different populations or different critical facilities, the amount of time that they would need to take protective action, how much skill they would need to have in terms of a forecast or some type of a forecast if they needed information 2 hours before a tornado to be able to move people to safety, and how those decisions and need for lead time might vary depending on whether tornado shelters were or weren't available. And after we formulated these, then we came to the matrix, and what we decided to do is, we decided to identify which research areas would be important in trying to carry out these projects. And then since the instructors also mentioned something about impediments, we tried to think about were there any particular impediments that we could foresee in undertaking some of these research projects. And so the first project to look at how emergency managers, schools, utilities, and others use these severe weather outlooks, thought they'd touch on the forecast and warning process, individual household behavioral response, population segments with disabilities, house emergency management, basically everything except 1 and 8 here. And in terms of the impediments, maybe the biggest challenge here would be coming up with a good sample of emergency managers and other users, especially if we don't know who the other users might be. It's hard to know who to talk to sample to get some sense of how they're using the forecast. So sample generation and data collection we thought would probably be the biggest challenge or impediment here. Second, the question of trying to evaluate how or forecast or identify how strong a tornado would be. That seemed to touch in the first 4 research areas, especially with 1 and 2. I think, and to a large extent, this I think we thought would be in research area 1, where the biggest challenge would be, and that's what we saw as the impediment. Does the science exist to do this in a reasonable period of time? Another way of thinking about that might be that this is a much longer term research goal than the other research needs that we've identified here. Our third point here about the verification process. Again, this would touch on most of the research areas, except for it was the community preparedness to respond to disasters that we didn't think would fall in here. And some of the impediments that we saw here was, one would be bureaucratic hurdles to implementation. In other words, if we happen to come up with any useful insights about the verification process, would it be possible to get the Weather Service or NOAA to adopt them? And then, perhaps maybe the bigger issue that we saw here is that the public might be so heterogeneous and have such different needs and expectations or uses for warnings that there may be no meaningful way to put together any kind of coherent set of verification criteria that would actually be very helpful, because you might need to have as many different criteria for verification as there are members of the public or groups in the public, and it might end up degenerating it into a hopeless task. And then for our for our fourth and final area, to investigate the lead time for different populations or critical facilities. And for this, we sort of, if the typical user of the warnings, who might just be able to go into their living in a home and moving into a in-home shelter or a interior closet or bathroom, they could use like this sort of standard warning. And so if there were other groups that needed the longer lead times, this would touch on the forecast area, the shelters, this was our one research area that actually got into the shelters side of things. And so most of the ones in between. And then, I don't know if we didn't come up with any impediments to this, or we were running out of time at the end, and we couldn't think of, we didn't have time to think of any impediments for this research area. And then we didn't actually get into the evaluation criteria. So we left that one blank.
Yeah, I guess after thinking about this a bit more, I guess the devil's advocate might ask, do we really need to know, as the tornado is approaching, how strong it is? Would that change how a person responds? For example, if it's an F5 or an F1, we would tell them to get underground either way, right?
Conceivably, it might. I mean, you know.
Well, from my perspective. Yeah, right. And I think that's actually a legitimate research question. To me, that's actually a research topic that we may find out that, no, it doesn't matter. But that somebody ought to do the research to find out if it matters. Because if it turns out that it's really important, then it's up to you guys on the physical side to figure out how to predict it. Yeah, but very few F1 ones kill people. You know, if you're in reasonable, that's the thing. Yeah, that's why I think it's a question. Yeah, Joe?
Yeah, and I think that to add on to that, so maybe F4, F5 it's a much closer call, but F1, F5, people are making decisions on what to do with something that may interrupt their everyday life. So I think knowing that difference does influence the way people perceive that event. And I think that from an organizational perspective, we might say, well, if I could control the world, I would want you to all shelter for every single one. But that's not really an achievable goal for every time for people to automatically respond exactly in the way that we think they should respond, because that choice happens among all the other things that are going on in people's everyday lives and all the other criteria that may not seem as pertinent or relevant to us because we view it from one perspective. But to that person who's viewing it from their life situation, there's a lot of other factors that are equally important to them in that moment, and the intensity may actually be one that pushes them towards this direction or the other. But I do think it's an empirical question. It's something that we can find out more about.
You know, I was, to follow on from what Paul just said, perhaps what we also need to consider is not simply how many fatalities have been caused by a particular storm, but what about the question of injuries as well, injuries in different size, which is going to be a larger category of things to worry about, of course. But you know, that might be also a criterion that one ought to govern the whole thing.
Yeah, I guess with regard to F1 versus F5, it's not so much what it is now, but what confidence you have that it's going to stay in F1. And we were discussing yesterday, there are certain circumstances where you pretty much know it's not going to be more than an F1 because the environment is not supportive or the storm structure is not supportive of a strong tornado. And yeah, I think it'd be great for the false alarm, you know, the greater false alarm problem if we could give some kind of nuance to that warning that people don't have to be going to their community shelters or whatever because of violent tornadoes coming their way. Alternately, of course, there are days when the SPC and everything is already giving guidance that violent tornadoes are possible or likely, and people would take different action.
Just to add what's been said, also keep in mind that, especially when we're talking about the false alarm rate, that at the local level, we may be initiating local warnings besides the National Weather Service for, and I know this is specifically about tornadoes, but for other criteria that meets our needs. For example, large hail, high velocity straight line winds, that may be before any tornado warning is actually issued or even developed, regardless of whether it's a F0 or a EF5.
I'll put my red hat manager on for just a second. That it matters to me in terms of what I need to prepare for a response if I hear these different levels, something bigger happening, something smaller, because it just takes forever, Red Cross being volunteers, to get to the shelters. It just takes a long time to get that machine grinding. So having any sense of size or duration or anything really kind of helps.
I just want to point out that the existing system already includes, I think Josh mentioned the SPC puts out outlooks for potentially long-track violent tornadoes. The SPC puts out tornado watches that are identified as particularly dangerous situations, and so on. So it's not that we have nothing now and that we have to develop something. There are some issues related to how effective those products are, and how well they verify, and then how well they are heeded in some way or another. Do they generate a different reaction among the users? We don't know that. That needs to be investigated, but the system we have now includes some components of what I hear being desired. So we shouldn't forget that already exists to a limited extent.
Yeah, and perhaps that's an area where short-term empirical research could be done to find out if, the fact that the SPC puts those products out may or may not matter to anyone, because they may not do anything with the information. Other questions and comments? Okay. Thank you, sir. Red. The white dot on the right is your advance. And there's your target mini-map. Okay. I'm just going to throw things on the floor.
All right, I think we felt tasked, at least initially, to try to come up with things that hadn't been discussed before, and a lot of the disciplinary groups covered a lot of things pretty well. So I think some of the more obvious ones are not in our list. So we also wrote less than some of these other groups, so I feel a little intimidated here, but I'll talk slower. And some of these were covered somewhat in other groups, but perhaps we just thought needed some elaboration. So the first was what to do about mitigating damage, which basically comes down to better buildings. And we discussed a lot the issues between new construction and old construction, using the Florida analogy of making new structures much better. You can certainly try to put building codes in. The issue, of course, is just cost and enforcement. But at least making buildings better. And this applies to both, I'll say, regular homes and manufactured homes. But new manufactured home building codes are better than old ones. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not we could try to retroactively make buildings better. We see a lot of really poorly built buildings having a lot of the damage, and at least anecdotally, and I'll get down to the fact that it's all anecdotal in Part D, but anecdotally we certainly see people hurt in these very poorly constructed buildings. There are analogies brought up of California, which has done some kind of requiring of retrofitting, I don't know if it was brick buildings or changing brick buildings that weren't earthquake resistant. So at least when there was political will, there was some ability to essentially make people, maybe with subsidies, but make people go back and make their old buildings stronger. So the issue really comes down, in many cases, to cost. We were then trying to, the sort of just bullets or items at the bottom were really issues that we thought were necessary, either in terms of what we needed or what the impediments would be to trying to implement something like that. One of the main issues was just cost. A lot of these are not well-to-do communities, and forcing people to get a new manufactured home is impractical. You could try to have subsidies for that, but I just don't know what the political climate would be to try to fund something like that. One of the issues came up from an engineering perspective is that designing a well-informed building code, we don't really know what the tornado environment is like, and there's discussion of whether there's extreme vertical winds or debris or other things, just really quantifying what you're engineering against in order to make a better building code. Another issue would be if you do require all these new building codes, you could displace people. For example, landlords would not be able to afford to do this. So essentially that housing stock or that rental stock would just go away. And so there might be unintended consequences to improving the building code, essentially displacing the poorer people in those neighborhoods. We felt this would be a very long-term cure. This is not something that could get implemented in the short term. Changing building codes requires both political motivation